Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards ascension, so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined by co-host Terry Robinson. Today on Tomes of Magick, we are going to talk about Technocracy Reloaded. Terry and I are both wearing our best suits for this episode. We expect our listeners to do the same. Anything else would be unmutual. Now, as we were preparing for this episode, we noticed that there are some very excellent alternative titles for this book, Technocracy Reloaded. Terry, can you grace us with a few of those?
I don't know if this is going to become a recurring segment or not, but sometimes something about a book just leaps out at me as being a hidden subcurrent. And I came up with three alternative titles for Technocracy Reloaded. The first is What to Expect When You're Expecting an Extraordinary Citizen. The second one is Convention Book, Thin People in Tight-Fitting Clothing with Short Haircuts. And finally, Tales of Magick. They told us we couldn't have metaplot, but apparently there are zombie plagues now. And those are the three titles that I think they should have considered.
After reading the book, I think they should have considered those. Okay, well, I wanted to open it up for announcements before we get into today's topic. I just have one announcement today. I went to North Texas RPG Con 2 weeks ago, and I met one of our listeners to the podcast. I met J. Neil III. I wanted to do a shout out to him. I sat in on his World of Darkness game during the convention. It was a lot of fun, and I hung around afterwards to talk to him and his wife. We talked about Mage the Ascension, how it's been played over the years. He has a Mage the Ascension Chronicle that he has been running for 11 years. He's having a lot of fun with it. Sounds like a game I wish I could sit in on. He lives in Texas like I do, but a little too far away from me for me to be a regular in his games. But I just wanted to give a shout out to J. Neil III. Thanks so much for the great conversation and the great game. And I am putting your links into the show notes so that listeners can see what you're doing online and see what you're offering on twitch.io, I believe it is. So thanks again. Terry, any announcements?
I do. Two things. One, this is kind of a general announcement in that we are redoing the webpage. We're going to be doing that over the next few months. Adam and I do most of the hosting. We have a number of guest hosts behind the scenes. Our producer, Joseph, takes care of the social media and the webpage stuff, and there should be a fresh coat of paint on that eventually. We also have a bunch of other projects coming down the pike that we'll talk about later. The other one is apparently the voicemail feature of our podcast was turned back on at some point, and someone called in to comment on how one of the options for what control could be is a result of the consensus that mortals believe that vast conspiracies or large organizations need to have some sort of shadowy figure in charge of it, and control within the technocracy could merely be that. And I thought that was kind of a neat theory. And that's all for me.
All right. Well, on today's episode of Tomes of Magick, we are talking about Technocracy Reloaded. This book came out in 2021, although I got my print copy just like a month back here in 2022. It has 12 contributing authors. It clocks in at 227 pages, and it focuses on the technocracy in Mage 20 to give us the detail that we did not have before. So, Terry, are you ready to give us a walkthrough?
It starts with a table of contents. And then the first image we get out of the gate on page 6 is somebody on a slab of some sort being stabbed a lot, which raised questions for me, because when I think of the technocracy and people being stabbed, it's usually much more precise. We get a prelude that consists of some sort of trap being sprung, whereby an agent of the void is killed by a collection of mages. This is apparently a plot action that has been set up through M20, but it depends on a piece of opening fiction, I think, that may have been cut from Book of the Fallen, and at this point, this arc has taken 6 years to finish. Did you have any thoughts about the opening fiction?
I actually liked this more than the other Prelude fictions I've seen in Mage 20. This is my favorite so far. Of course, nice to see John Courage again. But I think it displayed an idea running through this book of the Nefandi may have infiltrated the technocracy and they're doing awful things with, in this Prelude fiction, the Room 101, secret agent John Courage, who has experience with this sort of thing, and is also a powerful mage, we learn by the time of Mage 20, turns the tables and comes out all right, and And I thought this fiction was kind of exciting. It ended on a hopeful note. I got to see one of the familiar characters I liked. I was actually pretty happy at the end of this fiction piece.
The next section is entitled Introduction, Storming Utopia. This lays out what's going to be in the book. It says that the promise of the Order of Reason to bring order and progress to humanity has gone off the rails. The Union is disunified, flawed, bloody, and tyrannical. There is a promise of potentially being a new technocracy in the works. We receive some information on the sidebars that are going to be throughout the book. One is going to be a set of sidebars that say, hey, for more information, go elsewhere. Another one is called Disputed Data, which gives us other views of things. We have Future Fates, which are options on how your game or the world can unfold, and supplemental data that points at other books. We get the idea that the founding ideas of the technocracy are enlightenment and control. Enlightenment is tied to progress and plumbs the depths of human possibility and is not necessarily driven by curiosity. It is a very practical thing. We then get to see what that is in light of the different conventions. And since this is a technocracy book, frequently things will be like, well, this convention does it this way. We get the idea that the iterators are trying to get to enlightenment through upgrading biological forms, upgrading the human body, that the progenitors are trying to do it by evolving, by controlled evolution. The NWO is looking for unified and controlled consciousness of humanity. The Syndicate is looking to improve the material conditions of humanity through social and economic means. And the Void Engineers are satisfying the curiosity of the unknown. Control is brought through by the iterators fixing flawed systems with precision, the progenitors by purging flaws in the design of life, the NWO through discipline and patterns to control flawed institutions. The Syndicate is doing by trying to control the flux and whims of materialism. The Void Engineers are trying to expose hidden things dangerous to unseen minds. We then get themes, which are going to be power, progress, corruption, and extremity. That power is their greatest strength and weakness. They are the most obviously powerful faction in the sense that seemingly they have access to the most people and firepower. They have the cool toys if you play by their rules. They cannot share that power. They believe that it must be held by a unified elite. Progress is the idea of controlled movement forward. Progress without discipline or limit is dangerous, and humanity and other mages are incapable of guiding it. We get Isabella of Castile mentioned as a visionary leader, which I don't know if we have previous information on about the technocracy. We get the idea that they are dealing with corruption and that this could mean any number of things, that they force progress on those opposed to it. And the book breaks this down into a possible dark taint, maybe from the Defandi, or simple corruption in the form of greed and arrogance. And finally, extremity. And to me, this is kind of table stakes in Mage. If you really believe something and think that reality is on the line, you're going to be willing to do a lot of things to see it through. We also get a technocratic lexicon, which is quite extensive, along with just kind of a page of acronyms. That is the introduction. Adam, what'd you think of the introduction?
The introduction states that the technocracy can be whatever you want, and they give examples of how different people have chosen to portray the technocracy over the past, and I appreciate that. I encourage that sort of thing. But it is worth mentioning that throughout this book, they pick their portrayal of the technocracy and they stick with that. For example, in a chapter soon after this, they say this is the internal structure of the technocracy and how they handle their members. It would have been nice to follow that with a paragraph saying if you're having a brutal, harsher, more corrupt technocracy, change this and this. And another paragraph after that, if you've got a light, happy, positive technocracy, then change this and this. It's just like continuing support through the book for this do it your way would have been helpful, but perhaps reaching for a bit much there. Also, pages 16 to 17, Terry mentioned what the enlightened advancement looks like for these different conventions. And yeah, most of them I have to agree with, but I do take issue with Iteration X and Syndicate. For Iteration X, it says they're upgrading the physical body. And in every edition of Mage, Iteration X has had I think is the DEI, which is something that affects the mind of a person. So the technocracy is not just about the body, it's the mind also. And it says the Syndicate seeks to upgrade the human material condition. Well, yes, but I think there's a lot more to it. I think this statement ignores a lot of what we've seen in previous editions, including Mage 20. The lexicon section was not helpful. There's so much lexicon for the technocracy in the basic Mage 20 rulebook. This was just... it was too much for me. Also, reading through the acronyms section at the end of the lexicon, it actually reads more like parody. I think they got a little too silly there. Not sure about that one. But I'm ready for chapter 1.
Chapter 1 is entitled The Operatives Handbook, From Us to You. It starts with a in-world voice and leads with what consensus reality is, which is a strong move because this opening chapter is presented as a excerpt from a technocratic HR manual. So this is then presumed to be information that is common knowledge among the technocracy. And this is kind of the first time that we get the idea that the technocracy leads with understanding that reality is malleable. We also get a opening disclaimer of Think Globally, Act Locally, that there's something called the Regional Management Initiative, which propagates regulations and such to the specific regions of the world, that no longer is there a unified top structure that dictates how the entire technocracy will operate, that there may be subtle differences from region to region. And the book goes back and forth on whether or not this is common knowledge, or if it is something that if you mention the truth of it, you will be labeled unmutual. It talks about how each group has a different sign of unmutuality. So as Adam mentioned, the opening bit in terms of the acronyms are a little bit jokey. And one of the things, in my opinion, this book struggles with is going between being a satire or being kind of a send-up, being a tough as nails thing where you're just a field agent and so on, and you're on the front line of the reality war, and something much more contemplative in terms of what the technocracy can represent in a game. And in this chapter, we get some movement between those. We get the commentary on unmutuality and so on, as well as the whole framing of it being an HR manual, while also telling the dark truth, while also saying, hey, these are the games that you can run. It talks about how unmutuality, or the idea that you're not pulling your own weight, or mutuality kind of being the generic term in the technocracy for like being a good technocrat. It's used in a couple different senses throughout the book. An iterator may drop in productivity, an NWA agent may hide information, the progenitors may lack discretion, a syndicate member may flaunt wealth, and a void engineer may be distracted. So the thing to me about that is the NWO is all about hiding information. The progenitors are known for their lack of discretion, and the syndicate is commonly identified as flaunting wealth. Whereas for the iterators and the void engineers, no, those are legitimate concerns. They drop in productivity, and being distracted can be quite problematic when you're dealing with aliens on a spaceship. So like even within that listing, there felt like there was kind of a cleave. We are introduced to the T6 structure, which is the organization of the technocracy. T0, you are unenlightened. You are a person who is maybe working with the technocracy even if you don't know. A T1 is an extraordinary citizen, or someone with one dot in spheres that just has the ability to sense odd things. T2 are enlightened trained operatives. T3 are supervisors and managers. They tend to hold a rank within a facility. T4 is upper management, and the symposia may or may not be off Earth. T5 are the masters and oversight, and we don't get, at least initially, any information. And again, that jokey tone is held in a number of cases where it's like, T5, you don't have the clearance to see this. We also get the idea that the technocracy has different terms for people who are kind of not in that structure. An ally is someone who agrees with the technocracy on some level and maybe has an idea of what they are. An asset has no idea what the technocracy is, but is still useful. An associate is someone who secretly works for the technocracy, and citizens are just the generic term for support staff. The technocracy looks for new talent by going through large databases and looking for promising applicants. Their recruitment varies by construct, and it may be a thing where, nope, we're just all run by male clones or something like that. And one of the things the book I really think does a good job of is playing up how weird the technocracy can be. It goes over then kind of what each rank looks like for each convention, at least for the lower ranks, and kind of marks that as a T1 that you're brought internally for a couple of years, you're focusing on learning all the essential things. At T2, you probably return to society and you have a new life of some sort, new life being one word. You may work with some sort of front, you've earned some sort of autonomy. A T3 supervisor oversees a team, or a construct may oversee specific types of tasks of the larger one. Formerly, they were generally off-world. One of them is going to be in charge, and T4 and T5 are not at least initially described. There's a section called Actions Have Consequences that kind of look at how technocrats view their place. One is the 6 degrees. When you join, you start at level 3, with levels 1 and 2 showing that you are held in high regard within the technocracy. If you fail to complete missions or do any things that would cause a group to question your loyalty, you are moved down the scale until you hit degree 7 or degree absolute, where you are terminated, broken down into spare parts, or shot into space. We also get the Damien scale, which is an indication of how subtle you are in general, from being utterly undetectable to showing terminal deviance. We get a bunch of different amalgam types, which is to say a bunch of different groups that they can be cross-convention, where one convention leads. They can be a single convention activity. They can be some sort of low-light operation where it is low-powered characters doing something behind the scenes. It can be an internal group, or it can be a shockwave group who's just brought together briefly for some sort of mission that requires a fair amount of force. We do get some information on the avatar, which they refer to as as genius. They say it is important to interact with your subconscious and to recognize inspiration and genius wherever it can be found. They point out that other reality deviants do this in a disturbing way, and that it is not uncommon to have dreams, daydreaming, pattern recognition, some sort of imagined conversation, a sudden expression of scientific insight from natural phenomenon, or a burst of instinct to help guide you in moments of stress and to guide you towards understanding things. At the end of the chapter, we get a section that talks about what those T4 and T5 levels are, that there are something called management collectives, which are groups of managers that don't deal repeatedly with individuals, but oversee kind of larger situations. We get an update on the schism, that telepresence has helped calm the gap, but it's still there. It is ambivalent on whether or not the Avatar Storm happens. So throughout the book, it'll say, hey, if you play with the Avatar Storm metaplot, blah, blah, blah. Symposia are high-ranking technocrats that oversee the consensus in an area or region. Each member, a symposia has at least one member of each convention. Their goal is to prioritize threats. In a lowercase s sense, it is also the meetings where technocrats get together to argue. Supervisors are the highest level of technocrat normally seen by lower levels. They tend to be the level where control is held, and it may be the level of nephontic infiltration. There is mention to the hidden masters, which are off-world. It is suggested that once you get to a certain level, you are kind of become obsessed with dealing with personal projects and such. Upper management is a little bit more hands-on within their own little spheres, and people try and placate them and to not have them intervene because you don't want a master who is suddenly very interested in what you want to do. The Grand Old Men return, which is this potentially semi-immortal, possibly insane, possibly corrupt group that runs things. And in the absence of the Grand Old Men, or alternatively Control, the Shadow Parliament, which seems like it is a formal group that people would refer to formally, is an advisory council of one representative for each world symposia, that the representatives of the Shadow Parliament are generally clad in white and are simply known as management. And then finally Control, which is an entity which after the Avatar Storm seems to have faded. It is considered unmutual now, and it is vague to let the storyteller pick something. The above my pay grade section is kind of interesting in that I don't know if it's supposed to be a menu or if all of these things exist at once. One of the things that I wasn't sure about is one a set of ranks and one is a set of organization. I wasn't able to quite follow that. It's a bunch of interesting ideas, but to me, you kind of have to make some choices. To have upper management, the Grand Old Men, the Hidden Masters, the Shadow Parliament, Control on top of the Symposia with the Regional Management Initiative makes me question how the technocracy actually works, which may be the point. What did you think about Unit 1?
Okay, nitpick of mine. There are 6 levels or 6 layers of the technocracy, but they refer to them as 0 through 5. And so actually through the whole book, I was having to catch myself because they talk about the 6th level, number 5. It's like, couldn't they have just numbered them 1 through 6? I mean, they are the technocracy, right? I mean, they're supposed to be like really, really detail-oriented. I mean,
yeah, but in programming,
anyways, that
it's
was
pretty common for numbering to start from 0. But yeah, it's kind of weird.
Chapter 1, I saw a lot of rehash in here. I mean, there was a lot of stuff I saw before in Mage 20, and perhaps they expanded it a bit, but the whole time I was reading through Chapter 1, I was like, yeah, I know. Yeah, we covered this. Yeah, I got this. I just wasn't seeing a lot in Chapter 1 for me to really interact with because the previous Mage 20 books, as far as I remember, present all this before. Perhaps not in as much detail, but enough detail for me to run with it. So, yeah, I'm ready to look on to Chapter 2.
Unit 2 is entitled Targets, Assets, Tactics, and Plans. And it goes through a whole bunch of different types of kind of classes of entities within the technocracy. We get a review of the precepts of Damien. This I recall being covered in the core book in almost the exact same level of detail. And then we get to the target and asset section, which starts about unenlightened citizens. We used to be like them, sometimes called baseline reality quantums, reminding us that they are the basic unit of belief. And I thought that was an interesting framing. It talks about their tendentious relationship with amateur monster hunters and how they view them essentially as disposable. Vampires don't kill them without approval. They're referred to as hemophagic entities. Therianthropic entities, also known as werewolves, you can kill without approval. It also mentions that they are subject to attunement. Attunement is the idea that there's something you can do to bring someone into alignment with the technocratic worldview. It was super vague when we got attunement information later, and I was really thinking that that would be a process like terranorming or something like that, but we just don't get it. And why would a werewolf be subject to attunement but not a vampire? We get TBEs, Tinkerbell entities for fairies. They eat sanity, which I sometimes enjoy how refreshingly straightforward the technocracy view of some things are. We get various mages and the HSKN group, the Holy Shit Kill It Now group for Nephandian Marauders. We get ghosts and PDEs, which exist and are kind of reasonably described. I find it interesting that paradox entities are described as a type of PDE, which has a long name, along with juxtapositional manifestation, paraconsciousness, reality deviance, JMARDs, sure, and PDEs being pan-dimensional entities. So in this case, again, since this is kind of basic information, this suggests that every technocrat is vaguely aware of all the other things that go bump in the night, and generally they seemingly have an accurate view of things, which is, to me, kind of a change of previous editions where the information, especially about vampires, was somewhat flawed and inconsistent, much to the benefit of a chronicle that may use it. We also get information on the hierarchy of assets and resources. And the idea is this is a 0 to 10 scale where 0 is actively detrimental. They are hostile. They are a turncoat. You can destroy them without much difficulty. To 10, irreplaceable asset or operative. A theoretical rating as nobody is really irreplaceable as far as the technocracy is concerned, and are those most likely to pursue the greater good. I was hoping this would be slightly systematized in some way, saying like, hey, you were on a mission, you were dealing with something that had an HORA rating of 6 that was destroyed, explain yourself. There were a lot of cases where I really thought there would be like little subsystems or little systems that could be used to engage with these things, because the technocracy, more so than other groups, can have scales that could suddenly be made concrete, and they just kind of weren't. There was this infantile section on why mortals weren't recognizing how great the technocracy was. And one of the running themes of the book is apparently everything is bad right now. And okay, that's fine as a framing. It's the world of darkness. But all the other books have done so little setting building in terms of providing why the world of darkness is dark that to suddenly indicate it now just kind of seems off. Are they simply referring to the fact that climate change is occurring? Are they simply referring to political upheaval in certain areas? It just kind of has this generic sense of everything is bad and we don't like it, in a way that, again, is kind of hard to game. It is tough to tell what is commentary on our world and what is unique to the world of darkness. And outside of the existence of the Nephandi, maybe I don't get repeated insight into what that could be. They say it could be due to the Nephandi, it could be due to the dimensional anomaly, it could be due to the rise of fundamentalism and irrationality, or the traditions. And all of these were kind of milquetoast options. I thought they were kind of useful to say, hey, technocrats behind the scenes may argue with each other and blame certain things, but it talks about how they try and control what the masses know, and the technocracy doesn't invent so much as controls, which is interesting because previously we got a lot of information about how the technocracy innovates and then passes it on, where in Revised they say, yes, the technocracy is slightly ahead of mortal science in some areas, but sleeper scientists will frequently make breakthroughs the technocracy wasn't anticipating. It also talks about how the technocracy is more about trying to control narratives than anything else. But if the the Technocracy doesn't invent, then what do the iterators and progenitors do? We have a very clear dichotomy towards groups that do active invention and those who kind of control the social and media narrative. And that just felt kind of clumsy, and it was reinforced. Attunement is the process, as I mentioned, to get someone to fall in line, and it just didn't have a lot of information. It makes reference to the Master's Edge, which is the one adjustment we eventually get. We then are introduced to the doctrine of necessary force, and this breaks force use into two parts. One is the designated target force threshold, which is how much force you anticipate using against a target. And it goes from, yeah, you really shouldn't have any reason to do anything to them. They're either helpful to us or have showed no hostility in the past. And the acceptable force escalation thresholds, which is the level at which you need permission to escalate. So the one kind of guides the other. This can be you're not allowed to use force, to maximum force is entirely justified. Yes, call in the orphan-powered space laser and the orbital nuclear devices, which is only used for seemingly god-tier threats and will cause a gigantic mess. And these two just felt like money on the table, where we could have gotten more information on what each level of operation kind of looks like, what backgrounds it might tie to, or something like that. To put my cards on the table, I am a fan of the game Blades in the Dark, which does a very tight job of providing mechanics for what a group of characters are trying to accomplish and what they can achieve as a group, and provides mechanics at that level. And it just felt like throughout this book, it was kind of screaming for that. A little more guidance on how a mission is assembled and what things are justified in its pursuit. And hopefully we get that one day. Goes over the rules of engagement, which are don't kill mortals, defer to knocking things out, and don't let mortals see what you do. We get a section on mission planning, which felt kind of redundant in some cases, where it talks about investigation and then a second phase that largely seemed to be investigation as well. We get different mission paradigms, which I was really hoping we would get plot hooks for these, but we didn't. Page 72 also contains, I think, one of the most milquetoast illustrations we've ever gotten in a mage book, which shows a thin man in a suit with a short haircut looking out a window. Get nothing magey about it, unless that plate of apples is somehow a talisman. So maybe it's a matrix. That's going to be my canon explanation of that. And then the chapter ends. What did you think of Unit 2, Adam?
Page 58, there's an odd quote. Quote, aliens are bad, but they've got nothing on the damage an anti-vaxxer cult can do, end quote. So I'm to understand that an alien invasion is nothing compared to a group who disagrees with your stance on vaccinations? This is weird stuff. Targets and assets. This section reads like it was written by a junior high kid. Also, it doesn't contain anything we haven't already seen in Mage 20. Let's see, this chapter has a lot of rehash material from previous Mage 20 books. They slightly fleshed out some of it, but not enough to really make it interesting. And yeah, as Terry said, this was a great place to put in a number of interesting plot hooks, and they were not put in. Towards the end, we have types of missions and mission steps, and this was just boring as anything to read. I was reading through it, and I kept saying, obviously, we can all come up with this on our own. It just stands to reason that we would have this understanding when we're a storyteller running a Technocracy game. It just didn't need to be there. Yeah, that's basically my view on Chapter 2, so I'm ready to move on to Chapter 3.
Unit 3, Theaters of Operation, opens with an impressively dull chapter header art. This is a book full of remarkably dull art, but this one takes the cake. It's a graph with the NWO logo on it. It's a table, and people are looking at a screen. They're all thin. Theaters of Operation covers kind of what the Technocracy does. This section has me conflicted, as it generally says that the global outlook isn't great. As I said, I don't know if this is the authored commentary or how the World of Darkness is different. It goes over spheres of influence, and it just goes region by region, indicating efforts that are being done in various places, what convention does that thing, and kind of what the project intends to achieve. And this goes on for a while, and I don't know how to use them. A while ago, I think in literally the first episode that Adam had me on for, we talked about the difference between plot hooks and plot studs. A plot hook is an obvious thing where you can just be like, boop, drop into game, here's a story. A plot stud is something that implies that something could happen, but doesn't actually do it. So, I don't have a lot of information on how to use MedNet, which is a Iterator X progenitor initiative in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of the Congo, where it's like, yep, they fight disease. Okay, thanks. There are some that are periodically interesting. For instance, Second Guard Post 1 is the Egypt stuff guard post. They're like, they deal with mummies. And I'm like, yes, mummy in every book returns. Most of the others are utterly mundane technological initiatives, and there is no explanation of how the Enlightened would do anything. You could replace this in almost every case with a sleeper firm or government agency, and you get to the exact same place. This is also a marked departure from Revised, in that Revised kind of emphasizes the technocracy has influence, but it doesn't own as much. They have a few fronts scattered around, but they're not generally active businesses. They more or less do consulting and banking and intermediary services, and that's where they make their bank. But here, you get the idea that a mortal could be buying things from the technocracy and just not knowing it, or sleeper governments could be working with technocratic firms and not knowing it. It also mentions that, for instance, solar batteries provided by Iteration X can be reached by the datasphere, and I'm like, that's kind of cool or ridiculous. The illustration on page 84 sets a new bar for me. I don't know what that man on the left is doing. He's wearing a blue shirt and his mouth is suspiciously open. It says testing in progress in the back. North America is listed as a technocracy failure. Okay. And it just sounds like the author's wanting to yell about something. There's an aside on the 5 elemental dragons, which were the East Asian groups within the technocracy that were kind of a secret other technocracy. It's full of cursing. It calls it an aphonetic plot and completely dismisses it. So, like, one of the cooler things that we got out of Revised is just like, nope, you don't get that anymore. I do recognize that it does require suspension of disbelief that this giant technocratic conspiracy had within it a giant technocratic conspiracy. But it really felt like there had to have been a way to square that circle, as opposed to just being like, nope, they don't exist. What are your thoughts, Adam?
Well, actually, this is probably a good place to just come in and give, since I cover factions in the past, this is a good place to give a faction update. This one's going to be brief. The 5 elemental dragons were 5 societies hiding inside the technocracy, introduced in Dragons of the East for Revised Edition. They had names in English that started with court or temple, and a name in either Japanese, Chinese, or Korean. We have an episode and bonus episode on Dragons of the East if you want the full details. Mage 20 has made changes. This book has made changes. Each of the 5 groups is now attached to a convention very firmly. Also, the names in local languages and in English have been replaced with color and element. I'll go into it briefly. Temple of the Eternal Mountain was based primarily in China. Now they are attached to the progenitors and named the Green Wood Dragons. Court of the Chrysanthemums was based primarily in South Korea. Now they are attached to the New World Order and named Yellow Earth Dragons. Temple of the Eternal Harmonies looked like a natural for the New World Order, but Mage 20 removes them entirely. Temple of Heavenly Peace was based primarily in Taiwan. Now they are attached to the Syndicate and named the Black Water Dragons. Court of the Plum Blossoms was based primarily in Japan. Now they are attached to the Void Engineers and named the Red Fire Dragons. Metal Dragons was a nickname for the technocracy in East Asia in Revised Edition. The East Asian technocracy itself didn't recognize it as anything more than that. In this book, it is attached to Iteration X and named the White Metal Dragons. So that's the details.
We then get a mention that there is a 200 square mile ocean floor research facility. Just to note, that makes it 1,271 times larger than the largest building in human history. There's no mention of Yamaha Station or any of the oceanic research facilities that were introduced and revised. The chapter just kind of ends. What were your thoughts on the theater of operations, Adam?
Well, let's see. This chapter revives the notion from the first Syndicate Convention book in 2nd edition that the Syndicate wants a cashless society. This has not been mentioned for some time. I kind of have a hard time seeing why they would be passionate about it, but we discussed that previously on the podcast. Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm wondering, why are the Syndicate trying to reduce international trade? I thought they were kind of pro-international trade, just generally speaking. We come to Brasilia, and of course Brazil, talking about the New World Order, and they are encouraging resistance to the federal government. And I guess in certain times and places that might make sense, but it seems to me like it kind of runs counter to the basic philosophies of the New World Order. This chapter has a number of specific mentions of companies or initiatives going on in different countries, but a lot of them are not all that interesting, to be perfectly honest. Terry mentioned a specific one about they're doing medicine to help people in the Congo, and it's like, okay, that's nice, and there's other things like that, but it's just not terribly exciting, to be honest. Because I have such an interest in East Asia, I wanted to circle back around and give my thoughts on the update to the 5 elemental dragons. I agree the local language names should go, and the attachment to a particular country more than others, that should go too. I agree it was stretching plausibility for the 5 societies to keep their secret from the Western technocrats. However, I like the idea of groups that started in East Asia being brought into the technocracy in a past era and retaining some sense of identity. Some of the groups, especially the Temple of Heavenly Peace, had some cool ideas I don't want to lose. My complaint is how this was handled in this book. The text states the revised edition write-up was Nefandi misinformation, and anyone who acknowledges it is racist. This was canon information in Mage the Ascension for 20 years. The people who liked this or just wanted to keep pace with other Mage fans worked it into their chronicles, and now it is implied that their chronicles were racist and the technocracy couldn't keep out Nefandi influence. This is a bad way to treat customers. Yes, it's just my opinion, but I want to share that. Sidebar should have simply stated Mage 20 decided to change things. I don't know which authors wrote this, of course, but I don't want to single anyone out. A decision like this was probably discussed between several people responsible for Mage material. But that's my thoughts on Chapter 3.
If you thought the previous chapter opening art was boring, hold on to your butts for Chapter 4. It shows 2 dead-eyed men that appear to have been generated by an AI or someone actively having used a police sketch artist on a corpse to take 2 men and have them address a lady. No one is actually making eye contact, and it is clear that all of them have experienced Gilgul because there is no light in their eyes and their souls are clearly dead. In the background, there are 3 nearly identical people, and the art in this section is historically so bad, I don't know if that is a reference to clones or someone just being incredibly lazy. Above it is a drop ceiling, and everyone knows the technocracy is better than drop ceilings.
I absolutely can't disagree with that.
One of the recurring things is, I think if you were to ask me, in the same way that the Void Engineers are described by guns and tubes, the technocracy in M20 is defined by having remarkably reflective wooden tables. This is the second chapter in a row where the wood is polished to a near mirror finish. Unit 4 is entitled Internal Matters, and kind of describes what life is like inside of the technocracy if you're a child, in terms of raw page count. So the opening section is family, fortress, and home, and it talks about the technocracy is all many mages know. It talks about the types of people that are in the technocracy. One can be a baseline human, one can be enlightened, one can be a cybernetically enhanced human. Later, we also get cybernetic people as a different type, and I'm not quite sure what the difference is. I assume one is a mostly mortal with some cybernetic stuff, and the other is mostly cyborg with some human stuff. We get a return of the Adamites, which are people who kind of believe in baseline human supremacy, or I would presume enlightened baseline human supremacy. The thing that got me about the Adamites is I would want to see a paradigm that comes out of this. I would want to see information that shows this. Like, for instance, if the Adamites were something like the Mentats from Dune that said human potential is greater than any technological augmentation, and they were working on psionics or something like that to prove themselves right, I think that would be fascinating. Otherwise, they're just kind of a group of bigots, which is also fine. I just think there's more interesting options running around out there. We get a return of the victors, the progenitor perfect humans, modes who are manufactured celebrities, which I think we actually learned about initially in Book of the Fallen. We also get information about other types of entities, which include androids, mostly cybernetic people, experimental animals, soul flowers who are mortals that have kind of been turned into matrices that can hold quintessence, as well as aliens. We then get no information in the rest of the book ever on a single alien, except for one that is kind of an umbral entity. So either the book doubles down on the ambiguity of aliens, or it's sloppy. So either it then cites the matriarch as an example of how the technocracy has always had place for women. That's a choice. The matriarch is the artificial entity that runs Mecca, which is kind of the cybernetic hell prison of the technocracy.
Yeah, and that's going back to first edition, too. That hasn't been around for a while.
Yeah, that's like saying, what do you mean our court isn't diverse? Our chief executioner is female.
and an artificial intelligence. But she
yeah.
looks female. It's like,
Yeah.
what?
T1s and T2s, the lower levels, can't have families. And to me, this is probably one of the things that most thoroughly destroys this book for me, the commentary that technocrats... I understand that a technocrat who wanted to have a family would need superior approval for it, and there'd be a lot of paperwork, and seeing a technocratic honeymoon mostly consisting of, honey, how much money did you make from your second job in 2015? Okay. I think that would be a fun vignette. And then you go to like a moon of Saturn for 17 minutes or something like that. But just the fact that kind of the vast majority of people who know that they're in the technocracy can't have families seems hard. It does mention, though, that once you can have a marriage, it can be with a wide variety of things. I have listed here, it can be a clone, it can be a polycule, it can be a clone without sex organs. And then I also indicated spaceship, which I think is me having miswritten something, but I like the idea that in the technocracy, you can get married to a spaceship. It mentions that the void engineers generally don't get married when they're on ships, which kind of makes sense. We get information about technocratic babies called prodigies, which may be parentless, lab-grown, or made the old-fashioned way. All married characters are expected to help raise children. And since you can only get married if you're a T3 or higher, it suggests that most of your parental input is going to be done with people who are construct supervisors and have an arete of 4 or more. That's kind of fascinating. Progenitor tech will let anyone carry the baby, which I kind of like, and we get information on how the kids grow up, which is perfectly fine information. It is frustrating, though, to get that in great detail and all the other things we don't get. I try not to hold authors responsible for what wasn't written, but that was one of the things where it kind of stood out. It talks about the technocracy is for life, 'tis full, and talks about the political and internal stresses of being in it, that people in charge rarely want to give up power, that technocrats must balance obedience with over-obedience, and that grunt work is a common punishment, as is having to come up with a performance plan. And this is a part where the book gets a little bit more Kafka-esque in terms of its treatment of things. We get information on what sex is like within the Technocratic Union, its notions of gender and sexuality, and how different conventions and so on respond to that. We get an idea of how breakup and divorce occurs, so that's fine. We then get dissonant factions. Adam, who's in the technocracy and what are they doing?
Well, actually, for a faction update on this one, there are a lot of factions we have covered before, and I just wanted to give an update on what's new. Cross-convention initiatives are groups inside the technocracy that take their members from multiple conventions. Panopticon started in revised edition in Manifesto Transmissions from the Rogue Council. This group formed as a response to the Sphinx messages that came from the Rogue Council. In Technocracy Reloaded, they are recast as support agents for teams in the field, trained in the datasphere by the New World Order. They specialize in monitoring field agents, coordinating their communications, and getting them the intel they need. Another cross-convention initiative is the Challenge Fate Foundation. This is new in this book, started by a wealthy businessman who wanted to help the less fortunate with basic needs. It hires bright, hardworking people to head projects that help those in need. This is intended for chronicles that portray the technocracy as a positive help to humanity. The Department of Meta-Human Studies is another new one in this book, cross-convention initiative, but it is directed by members of the progenitors. This group builds on current public interest in superhero entertainment to recruit willing volunteers who want to undergo special treatments and training to push their abilities to superhuman levels. This group is intended for storytellers who want to bring elements of superhero entertainment into their mage games. And that's really covering what's new in this book.
We also get kind of an update into a bunch of groups that we have gotten information on before. It gives us information on the Adamites, the baseline human or enlightened baseline human group. Again, I wish there were a little bit more about them that was kind of interesting, maybe a weird way in which they're onto something, or a victory that they had. Cassandra Complex, which is an organization that oversees vast amounts of statistical data that recommends that agents intervene in a particular way. Give them an agenda in some way that I can run with if I want to. Friends of Courage is called a methodology at one point, which implies that they are formally recognized. The Harbingers of Avalon Sure. Project Invictus, this is simply wasted space if you're not actually going to say anything. This is several paragraphs to have a joke about, look how cheeky we are, no one's going to talk about it. The Special Information Security Division, which is the group that covers up the departure of the SPD. We get the SPD, the Special Projects Division, which is the group that is seemingly generating money out of nowhere, even though no one has seen any of its members for quite a while. I think Adam brought this up before. This SPD has now been missing for 20 years. After the Avatar Storm, I will give you 6 months in which you can do this. But at the 2-decade mark, when this conspiracy is now old enough that it can drink, I think you need to come up with something else. The SEAI is a group that is pushing for the advancement of extraordinary citizens. They won an Avatar and they're sorceress. We got no information that extraordinary citizens kind of know what an Avatar is. And we get no information on sorcery. This group knows a lot. It is kind of would upset the balance within the technocracy, especially considering their raw numbers. I'm not sure why the Union wouldn't just quash a movement like this, unless they are exceptionally well hidden, which is impressive considering they don't have access to enlightened procedures. We then get an update on the conventions. This filled in an important role that if you are only playing M20, you will likely need this information, because what we got in the core book isn't enough to run with. If you have a firm notion of what it is, what the conventions are from 2nd edition or from revised, this doesn't add a lot except for to kind of update you maybe on methodologies you may not have remembered. In revised, most of the conventions got one. A few things leapt out at me. One, in the iterator section, apparently there were never class 10 hit marks. In Gods and Monsters, we get more or less 2 through 9, and then in this book, we get the class 11. So, hit mark X, meh. It also says that research is mostly done by T3s, and that didn't make sense to me. You figured there would be a vast group of people that would be doing mundane and enlightened research, and to limit that to T3s, I feel that this kind of suggests that the balance of enlightened mage types in this book may be a little bit dissonant internally. The NWO indicates that the Ivory Tower is pushing for autonomy and diversity, is dealing with the advent of the exceptional citizen, which is different from an extraordinary citizen. The progenitors make mention that the Nefandi are creating zombie plagues. And I'm like, oh, that's funny. And they're like, no, literally there are zombie plagues. Interesting. The progenitors also have a grant writing division, which you figure literally every other group would have, especially considering that the progenitors are notable for having a vast illegal operation that provides drugs to people. And generally, people will pay for drugs. We get the syndicate view that immortals are shareholders in reality, which I kind of liked, but also kind of makes them much more of a stakeholder capitalist group than shareholder capitalist group. It moves back on them not generally being business owners, and in this it is very clear that they control vast financial empires. The thing that confused the dickens out of me is in here there is a section on fencing and why so many syndicate members do it, and it took me reading the entire section to realize they were referring to the thing where people with swords poke each other, and not the act that occurs in illegal commerce, which the syndicate does, where you sell something that you stole. They found the one case where there could be ambiguity between the two different verbs to fence. It is also one of the only cases where we get information on the T4s, that we have the VPOs within the group. We get none of that information on any of the other conventions, which I don't know how you don't provide that somewhere. It mentions that the Void Engineers are militaristic, regardless of the dimensional storm. That is a change from previous editions, where prior to Revised, they were much more exploration and they happened to kill things from time to time. We get Alpha Fleet, which is in charge of First Contact. This is yet another indication that the Technocracy is doing a lot with aliens, and we get no information on said aliens. We get the idea that there is a massive shipyard in the near horizon, that there is a group that deals with alien artifacts. We then get none. So there's a lot of opportunity here that is not taken. It is probably essential if M20 is all you're using. What did you think about the rest of Chapter 4, Adam?
Chapter 4 was a very big chapter. It was the largest chapter in the book, and a lot of material here. For me, it kind of divides up into 2, because you've got the stuff before the 5 conventions, and then you've got the 5 conventions. It's like, in my mind, it's like 2 chapters in one. But let's see. Before the convention write-ups, we have progress versus conformity. This section describes fundamental and far-reaching changes in the technocracy that would not occur unless the top leadership were removed. It strongly implies the revised edition metaplot happened. Let's see, the idea on page 100 of an expanded definition of the word person or human in the technocracy is a good idea, but it needs support. There should be a sort of IQ minimum recognized by the technocracy along with their own kind of Turing test with its own name. It would be interesting to take it a step further and have progenitors making clones and iterators making AIs that are right below that mark and then exploiting them viciously because, hey, it's okay, they're not really people. There are hints in this book of how the technocracy are doing awful things, and there are dark elements in it, and this would have been a nice way to raise it up and say, look, here's one of them.
I really like that idea. That is all.
We're talking about the syndicate convention. It says, taking what you want, after all, is a core philosophy within this convention, end quote. And I was reading this thinking, says who? Seriously, who says this? When did this become a thing? That took me by surprise. Page 114, Power Status and the Inevitable Shark Tank. It's worth mentioning that it isn't just selfish leaders who keep accomplished field agents from advancing to leadership. Ability and accomplishments are not really enough to be a top leader of the technocracy. A candidate must also demonstrate they understand the subtle forces and principles that exert influence on the universe to be a leader. And that is my way of saying that a leader of mages is not exactly the same thing as a leader of sleepers. It's not enough to say, look at my record and look at what a hard worker I am. You also have to say, look, do you have an understanding of what's going on in the larger supernatural world? Because we are, after all, mages. This is kind of what we cover. I was blown away by page 118. They have a quote here. Or look for Secret Agent John Courage, at least. He's easy to spot. End quote. Okay, look, folks, seriously. Secret Agent John Courage has an arcane of 5 and extensive intelligence field experience. He is just not easy to spot. I'm sorry, but I'm calling that one out. Before page 126 in this book, where we start the write-ups of the 5 conventions, this is basically 125 pages of material that actually is not all that useful to me. Page 126, where we start the 5 convention write-ups, this is where the book started speaking to me. So getting into the 5 conventions on page 129, saying the timetable has been wrong so often it's, quote, a joke, is quite a statement. Authors should avoid making the technocracy look incompetent. Iteration X write-up repeatedly states they have accepted the world and the future cannot be controlled and cannot be predicted. It's like they've given up on being technocrats. This section states technocrats struggle to keep up with sleeper science and technology. This doesn't make the technocracy look good. It was interesting for me to note in the write-up on the New World Order, the Enlightened Shock Core has been reactivated in 2018, but they don't use Atlas units anymore. Atlas units are big, large, tall, steel-looking cyborgs with heavy weaponry mounted on them. They have 2 in storage for big emergencies, but for the most part, they don't use them anymore. So Enlightened Shock Corps are back, but they don't have the same shock they used to have. At page 138, we get a sidebar. It makes sense that the Feed, which is part of the New World Order, would notice the online efforts of the Nefandi groups. They don't know the name of Heralds of Basilisk, but they've got a sense that, hey, look, there's a group doing something here, and they probably aren't just sleepers because they are very good at what they do. And so I think that was a nice way of taking some material from Book of the Fallen and picking it up and doing something with it. There's no mention that the New World Order is the leader of the technocracy. This is not just from Revised Edition. I think all 3 editions of Mage, certainly Second and Revised Edition, stated that the New World Order are the leaders of the technocracy, but they're a little bit balanced out by the fact that the Syndicate are the bank and the funders of what the technocracy does. But this book makes no mention at all that the New World Order are or ever were leaders of the technocracy. So that seemed like a strange omission to me. The departments in the progenitor write-up, these are not methodologies, but they operate a lot like methodologies. If these departments were really a thing, it seems to me like the methodologies would in time simply fade away because the departments are doing the methodology's job. The Syndicate write-up was a little too simple-minded for me. I guess I kind of expected that coming in, but the overuse of financial and business terms made it look like a parody. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but couldn't help noticing it. It is interesting to see the syndicate's enforcers have gone from being police in Revised Edition to being criminals again. I thought that was kind of cool, although page 155 seems to contradict this, saying that, no, they are in the police and private security forces again. So I think it would have been helpful for me, at least, to explain how they are heavy into organized crime, but they're also heavy into police and private securities. It's like, is it both? Is it one or the other? I liked the idea that the syndicate members were into fencing, as in traditional European light sword fighting, as opposed to the heavy two-handed bastard swords that weighed a ton and were meant to give a really hard swing to punch through old-style armor. Fencing makes sense to me for the syndicate. It's hard for me to see syndicate members going all into Asian martial arts or Brazilian martial arts. Fencing comes across as more sophisticated and I guess you might say dignifying. It's a great way to keep in shape. It does traditionally, Western fencing does have a heavy emphasis on precision movements, precision results, targets, measurable improvements in your technique. And so I think this is actually a cool idea. This was new in this book. I don't remember in any past write-up of the syndicate hearing about them being into light sword fighting. So I actually like that. It makes sense for me. Neither here nor there, but I can totally picture Terry with a fencing foil in his hand, mopping up on a couple of people. But not saying that Terry's in the syndicate. I would never say that. The tone of this chapter was different than the preceding ones. The conventions in this chapter sound more kind of mild-mannered and upbeat, taking more cues from the later convention books of Revised Edition. The chapters before this chapter, they seem to want to emphasize that, hey, there are darker elements in the technocracy. They may be up to no good behind the scenes, but this chapter was more like, hey, they're nice guys, and don't worry about them. They're a lot like companies, except for the Void Engineers, which are a lot like the military. I was a bit disappointed that in a book with this much page count, they didn't do more with internal groups in the technocracy and methodologies within the conventions. I mean, this would have been a great place to innovate and run with some new ideas now that the Revised Edition metaplot has eased off. Really, it was just a lot of methodologies and internal groups that I have seen in Revised Edition and were even mentioned earlier in Mage 20. So it would have been nice for them to kind of loosen up a bit and try something new here. But, okay, that was a lot of me talking about Chapter 4. Let's hear about Chapter 5.
I liked your thoughts about Chapter 4. Chapter 5 is entitled Unit 5 Q Division, where we go over the stuff. This starts off with a bang with a section on, hey, adjustments are just their term for coincidental procedures. And to really drive the point home, we get one. Then we get information on procedures, which is to say, hey, this is what technocratic vulgar magic is. And then to drive that home, we get one. It feels super weird to have a book that covers literally one of the core factions of the game. And we get two effects. We get two. And one of them is a rehashing of Mind 2. We then go on to Technocratic Gear. And gear starts out with gadgets, which are mass-produced and they're employable by extraordinary citizens if they are properly trained. And then it says all but the most esoteric gadgets can be used by them. Tell me which ones they can't use then. Have like a star or something that says, nope, normies can't use it. Even the special normies, even the kid that reminds the teacher that they forgot to assign homework, unless he's enlightened, he doesn't get to use the special hand grenade. The thing that got me about this section is it relies on what is an underlying not great stuff system. Like, a lot of things contain primal energy, but they're one shot. Does that reduce the difficulty, or does it just all get discharged? Does that mean a technocrat can take that one shot item and pull it out? I think it should have included like a little primer on how these things worked, because there's a one-off mention in Book of Secrets. It's like, yeah, you use it with a difficulty roll of 7 using your Arite. And like, that's a one throwaway thing in a book that defines how one interacts with a device. And that's a bit much. I like the spray cam, which is a type of spray paint that just covers an area with cameras. We got BFF, which was super, super glue. We got Liam, which is a person-seeking hand grenade. And then we have the trinket section, which is usable by the massives. The operatives dossier includes information on all agents in a 100 square mile area. I love the idea that they are all the same size. So the one that covers like the region around Hong Kong and the one that covers rural Wyoming are both the same thickness. I also wouldn't be surprised if the Technocracy literally maintains a uniformity of technocratic agents across the surface of the globe, not based on population, but based on area. So like the high north of Canada and the Sahara Desert have equal coverage as like New York City or something like that. We get the parkour slippers, which are actually, I would argue, an infernal device in that you gain dexterity, but at the cost of being caught wearing Vibram 5 fingers. We get devices, which you need to be awakened, which are finger guns, which are great because you could shoot a guy. The problem is they only have 2 points of enlightenment, so you can do 2 damage. So we get the helping hands, which are the Half-Life Alyx gravity gloves, the universal neutralizer device, which just breaks things, and I am here for it. They have the octopus suit, and I really hoped this was going to be something that gave you arms. No, it helps you blend in. It should be the chameleon suit. Otherwise, you're just disappointing people who see octopus suit and are like, arms for days! One of the vehicles is listed as the Symposium on Wheels, which I just love as a concept. The NIMBY 50, which defeats an enemy by launching them into space. This is a technology I want more information on. And I would love to see the presentation of this by like the Syndicate Research Division, where it's like, since time immemorial, mankind has thought to defeat its foes by throwing them great distances. And it just like shows a whole bunch of people heaving someone into the ocean and then a catapult and then like a large human cannon. But now with the NIMBY 50, and it just shows someone shoving like a space octopus into a volcano or something. We get a sleep teacher, which is, I think, the first device in M20 that actually reduces XP costs. It is the thing that allows you to super cram and then buy things at a discount, which is pretty great and would systematically explain maybe why the Technocracy is better trained. Enhancements are things that are baked in. We get the DEI. We then get inventions, which use your own arete, and all of these were fine. I have, with the Technocracy, kind of a difficulty of being like, well, if you're bringing your own arete, why are we using that instead of everything else? There was also like kind of an opening sidebar that says, hey, technocratic agents can kind of infer the principles and jury rig something together. I would have liked a little bit more on that because it's one of those things where it's like, oh, now you need the jury reading skills, secondary skills, woo, everyone take a drink. And you figure that's something the Technocracy would be real good at. We didn't get like a really refined investigation of how technocrats employ focus and so on, whereas in previous editions there was kind of a thing that said, hey, technocrats seem like they're super disabled without their toys, but we have these other things to work around. It's kind of implied when they talk about practices like Dominion, but a little bit more threading that together I thought would have been nice. What did you think about Unit 5 Q Division, Adam?
Well, this was a very practical chapter with a number of interesting things. The Funhouse Grenade, I thought, was absolutely cool. I would love to use that in my games. It's basically forces to manipulating a device where you throw it, it puffs out, and light and sound are distorted because of the forces to effect. And so it's like you can't really see if things look closer or farther than they actually are. Things look distorted and wild. I would love to play with that as a storyteller in a mage game. That would be fun. The Operative database. Who in their right mind in the Technocracy would trust the reliability of this database? Seriously. I mean, every group in the Technocracy is going to be given the option of obfuscating information in there to help sensitive projects or sensitive field agents. And so by the time you get to use the Operative database, so much has been redacted that who's going to trust it? It's like, wouldn't any technocrat look at the others in his amalgam and just kind of smirk and like, yeah, that's useless, I'm not using that. The octopus suit, I thought was cool. I agree with Terry that when I first saw it, it's like, oh, it's going to give you extra limbs or something tricky like that or help you in the water, and it doesn't. But what it is, I think, is actually pretty darn cool. It's not just a chameleon suit. It actually creates different textures or appendages or things that can actually stick out that helps it blend in. So it's like a chameleon suit to the power of 2 or something. It's like a really, really good camouflage suit. It's like something I don't remember seeing before in mage books, but it sounds like a really cool idea and a really cool use of enlightened procedures. So I thought that was awesome. The neuro-optical transmitter is lifted right out of the, I think it was late 90s Men in Black movie. It's like, yeah, you can have this object you hold in your hand. It a bright flash of light, and it uses a Mind 3 effect, and whatever you say to the people who saw the bright light, they totally believe you, and it changes their memories. It's like, okay, look, any mage storyteller worth his salt has been introducing that into their games for the past 20 years, and now we see it in a mage book. It's like a little late to the game on that one, but I guess, if for those few people out there who haven't already put it in their game, I guess it's fun to see it here.
The word you're looking for is for storytellers who are not 35 or older. Yes.
Okay, maybe. You got me there. The cognitive attenuation transmitter is something I would totally love to play with. Again, I thought this was a very clever idea. It is basically a device that shuts down cognitive thinking in the area, and a person's first thought is, how is that useful to anyone? It's like a super mental distractor, that effect, like area effect. But I liked it because in the world of Mage, in every edition of Mage, there are beings, Umbrood basically, from the High Umbra, that can latch on to humans' thought processes and really distort them and do crazy things with them. And so if the Technocracy has had encounters with these for the past several years and knows that this is a thing that we are going to encounter, then they say, look, how do we counter this? We really don't understand these very, very strange things that come out of the Umbra, so we're going to just make this device that shuts down cognitive thoughts so that when one of these really strange creatures appears, the damage it can do is greatly minimized, and we can, train our agents to sort of deal with this extreme mental distraction device so that they can somehow deal with these strange creatures when they appear. So, long story short, I think this is a reasonable response to things that technocracy agents actually encounter in the field, and that's why I think this device is very cool, and I would have fun playing with this in a scene with my own players. So that's my thoughts on Chapter 5. What is in Chapter 6?
You said, I would love to use the funhouse grenade. I was waiting for you to say, on your children. Rather than a table. Like, Dad gets alone time. Bye, suckers. So I thought the previous chapter, frontispiece, set a new bar for remarkably unremarkable chapter art. But Chapter 6, oh man, it is an empty conference room, and it is a bunch of giant placards just kind of with the Syndicate logo on it, where a man in tight-fitting clothing and close-cropped hair looks sad in front of a woman with a relatively tight haircut and close-fitting clothing. But she maybe has a weird tattoo on her neck, and that's about all we get. There's no reflective. The wood is still quite reflective for those keeping track at home. Unit 6 is entitled Human Resources, the Few, the Proud, the Enlightened Elite. We are introduced. This chapter is a list. Normally, it would be organized into awakened people and unawakened people and weird stuff. But in this case, it's like, nope, we're just going to list them all alphabetically. Okay, that's a way to do it. A little table that would be like, hey, this is kind of it broken out by type would be great, which was confusing to me because sometimes I was expecting an enlightenment score and in other cases I wasn't. Aegis is a type of robot that is just accepted as a cop, which is kind of interesting. We got Amy, which requires gods and monsters to use because... and a number of the other ones do because they just kind of make references to charms that aren't in this book. We get the Black Daggers, who are the NWO Elite Strike Force. We got the Draculaser, which comes from a planet full of deadly microbes and is a H.R. Geiger-esque gun. We get Gamma, the alien, who is just waiting to outlive everyone. We get Hana Kajiwara, who is a mortal who is reborn onto the digital web and now believes themselves to be immortal. We get the Smart Octopus, which I would call the Smoctopus. We get a Saber-Tooth Tiger, which is introduced as an emotional support animal, and this pleases me to no end because this is one of the few very dynamic pieces of art in this book in comparison. And we just get a list. Adam, what did you like in the list?
I liked Smoctopus. I can't get that out of my head now. The whole rest of the day, I'm going to be snickering Smoctopus.
Yeah, Ulysses, the Smoctopus.
Okay, my thoughts on Chapter 6. There's an entry called Carbon Copy. This was a complete waste of space. It's basically saying, did you know the Technocracy can make copies of people and stick them in to imitate where those people... It's like, yeah, the first edition core book went into detail on that. Yeah, I am aware of that. We've seen that in every edition of Mage. And did you know that these carbon copies will probably have above average manipulation and acting skills? It's like, yeah, that goes without saying. Thanks a lot. That didn't need to be there. But I did like the entry for Leona, and she is basically, this is an NPC that was created by the progenitors. She is not a normal human being. There are certain things about her that make her much more resistant to radiation, disease, direct sunlight, other sorts of things that would happen after a major disaster. So she's basically the survive disaster girl. And she and the other few members who are created like her are in the outback in Australia. They live a very secluded life. They have to live in like a shelter underground. They can only come up and see the sun in the outside world when there's nobody else around and for short times. And so basically she's thinking, gosh, if there was a disaster, then me and my friends would survive it better than anyone else, and I wouldn't have to be locked in a box all the time. Maybe disaster's not such a bad thing. So I was reading this thinking, okay. So this small group of survived disaster, especially engineered people, they're going to meet up with find out that there's one or two other groups like them in the technocracy. Say, hey, let's get together, and then of course they get contacted by the Xyz from Book of the Fallen. It's like, oh, you want a disaster? We can provide a disaster, and it snowballs from there. I'm telling you, storytellers, watch out for this stuff. I gotta agree with Terry. There were a lot of kind of unremarkable entries in Chapter 6. I mean, some of them are useful. I'm not gonna say it's a bad chapter. There is useful material here, but a lot of it was kind of not so exciting stuff that you would either have seen before or would expect to see in a chapter like this. So that basically wraps up my thoughts on Chapter 6.
Chapter 7 is entitled Mission Control. We get information on game types, genres, and story hooks, and the story hooks really phone it in. It's remarkably vague. Things like, you discover that your supervisor doesn't have your best interests at heart. Okay. And another section it goes, someone's collecting blood. They might be a vampire. And you're like, oh, okay. There's some very basic information on just table safety, which is now the third time that this has been done. There's the statement that technocratic games are not really that different from anything else. Why did you write a book on it then? But to me, the technocracy is the perfect entry to Mage because it gives you a mission structure. It gives you a hierarchy to work with. It is so fundamentally different, unless we're talking about at the level where it's like you embody a character and stories are told. Sure, in the same way that calculus and Spanish are similar because they both use symbols to convey information. Sure, I just don't think that's the framework. We get a bunch of different genres, which to me, to do a genre like Solar Punk or Weird West kind of requires departing fundamentally from the core World of Darkness setting or doing it in a different place, which is fine, but there isn't enough information to flesh out those worlds. We also get hallmarks, and they aren't described. I would have liked a little bit more on that. And again, oh man, bulleted list. A lot of the plot options are just kind of identical to what was listed previously. Like there's one entitled Your Team is on Damage Control. Earlier we had a whole section on doing veil outs and damage control. Like this is strictly less than that. I have no further comments on this chapter. How about you, Adam?
Yeah. Chapter 7 was a bit odd for me because it says it's a storyteller advice chapter, but when you look at chapters 7 and 8, they are both storyteller advice chapters. Chapter 7 is the less specific one. Chapter 8 is the more specific one. So that was... But talking about chapter 7, the first 3 pages are general storyteller advice. This chapter should focus on technocracy-specific stories. Also, putting this book down, who is going to remember general storyteller advice is in the Technocracy book? It's just not the place for it. Setting the scene is another section. I've got to say, it's useless. The core book covers this. The genre section covers 3 to 4 ideas you could play with in genre that it is specific to Technocracy, but it's not the standard Mage 20 setting. So it's like they run off into totally different places, but don't give you a lot of support for doing so. So I got a question, is that really the best choice here? I think a genre section should have stuck to the Mage 20 setting from the point of view of Technocracy. It would have been more useful then. Now, there's a section, When It All Falls Apart. I thought this was good advice. Technocracy characters in a game will be punished for real and imagined mistakes, and storytellers have to make it work at the table. So basically, if you've got a corrupt supervisor or if some NPC is framing your characters for something, then in the story, their supervisors will punish them, and you're going to have to make this a part of the game where the players see their characters getting punished for something they didn't do, or for some, more than they think is reasonable. And you have to, as a storyteller, you have to keep in mind that, this needs to work at the table. I need to keep these scenes short. I need to make it clear to the players that I am not, as a storyteller, punishing them for being dumb players. It's just something that happens in the world that they've got to expect. And as players, they got to roll with this. It's life in the technocracy. So that was a useful section. Okay, two things I would have liked to have seen in this chapter. Why do we still have no practical suggestions for getting characters out of the technocracy and into the traditions or disparates? As I have talked to mage fans of all stripes over the years, something that I hear about again and again and again is player characters who started out as technocracy agents, and they got out of the technocracy and they teamed up with the other players who are tradition mages or craft mages. This book should have addressed that. It should have said, hey, look, if this is something you want to do in your game, here's some things you ought to think about. Here's some ways to make it work better. We're going to help you do this because we know you guys have been doing it for years. But no, there's no mention of it. There's just mention in this book of leaving the technocracy. That's unthinkable. Well, obviously it's not unthinkable. We've been doing it for years. Page 217, they talk about going off the grid when, as player characters, the technocrats have been accused of something awful, and so they need to lay low until they can prove their innocence. This is a recurrent theme in action movies in all the languages of our world, and so yeah, I totally get that we're going to do this, but let me just say this. Horizon Realms are a great place to lay low when the heat is on, and that was not mentioned in here at all. Great places to hide. Just saying, if the Mage Revised Edition metaplot really is an option for Mage 20, then why can't we talk about Horizon Realms anymore? I feel like I would get together with a bunch of Mage 20 fans and I say, Horizon Realm, and everybody goes, and they all look at me. I'm like, oops, I'm sorry. Okay, so that wraps up Chapter 7. How about Chapter 8?
Chapter 8 is entitled A Parallax View, and this goes over metaplot options. One is that the council is corrupt. Another is that the traditions are broken. Another is that something real bad happened and they have to ally with the traditions. Sure. Another one is an indication that Autochthonia is an incarnate, which is kind of small potatoes. Maybe Celestine, you'll get my information. That would be entirely stoppable considering it's a planet. I like the idea that it's a very large but comparatively weak spirit. We get some options on the SPD, but they're boring. We also get the idea that Threatnull could be Marauders or Nefandi, or Threatnull could hate the Nefandi. Or, yeah, it just felt like a combinatoric exercise. The other thing that this did was it used wild with a Y, which is a werewolf construct. Again, M20 continues to use werewolf cosmology in weird places. Seems especially weird in a technocracy book. We get the littlest bit on what the Threatnull conventions are. Please see Void Engineers Revised if you in any way want to use that. And then the book is over. What did you think about Unit 8?
Well, a few things stood out for me. Generally speaking, with Chapter 8, you're right. They give a few passing references to, you could do this, or you could do that. I mean, we've mentioned it before in Mage 20, but you could totally do that. It's like, yeah, I kind of know, and you kind of said that before, and you're being so vague about it that is this really helpful? Anyways. But on page 223, they had a quote that just hit me right between the eyes. The masses are dumb, greedy, and likely to get us all killed, end quote. The majority of human beings are that bad? Well, let me just say, I'm glad the enlightened few are writing the Mage 20 books. On page 224, quote, a conflict between a Mammonite and a syndicate member can shatter a local economy, end quote. That's like, well, yeah, but not necessarily. It might shake loose the constraints that are holding back people in the community. It might be a freedom-granting opportunity or a revealing moment when a lot of secrets come to light. I mean, a Mammonite and a syndicate member fighting it out in a community could open up a lot of possibilities. It might not necessarily be a disaster. So there's more than one way to look at that. Yeah, a lot of vague points here. This was a good place to put in some, inspirational or neato ideas, and I just didn't see a lot of that here. So I guess we're ready to talk about the book in general. Terry, what were your thoughts?
It feels like a missed opportunity. There was a shift in voice very much between a jokey paranoia style, which could have been super fun, and a down and gritty, these mortals don't understand what we're doing for them, and a much more contemplative zone of the technocracy is a unique way to explore interesting questions in Mage, all of those interpretations have their space and all are useful and good. I don't think the way we should shift through them is arbitrarily as you move through a chapter. It's one of those things, address it in sidebars, have a section talking about tone that goes through it. It discards what I think is some of the neat stuff from Revised. We get rid of a lot of the finer points of the enlightened anthropic principle about data being self-organized. We get very little gameable material. We don't get constructs. We don't get aliens. We don't get initiatives that are involving with other supernaturals. I'd almost prefer this be done like a giant city book where you get a little bit of information about what all the other factions are doing. The consistency in editing started dropping towards the end, where Enlightened Citizen and Technocrat stopped being uniformly capitalized or not capitalized. The tone was all over the place between zany camp and other things. We didn't get a mission structure on like how to gamify that and how XP would be rewarded. Intra-convention conflict was dropped. In Revised, it very much wanted to say that every faction and sub-faction has internal fights. The Technocracy doesn't seem to have that. We don't get information that the progenitors are running around cleaning up messes from other people, or that there is the cult of the machine in the iterators, or that some members of the Void Engineer may have gone Nefandi or something like that.
Yeah, New World Order versus Syndicate, it wasn't here.
It very much felt like a box-ticking exercise, where they're like, what are the things a Technocracy book would have to cover? Okay, we wrote a paragraph on it. We're done. We get no information on systems for extraordinary citizens, and that felt like something that was missed. I think this does a perfectly fine job of providing a book on how to run a Technocracy game. 50 pages of it is rehashed from the core book, and I really would have liked that 50 pages of material, but at the same time, it doesn't quite go to the extent of being able to run a mage game out of this book, which could also have been another goal, in the same way that like for Exalted or other games that have fat splat books that you can almost run out of that specific book. There are some unfortunate editing errors. Did you notice the Technocracy stronghold in the city of Hong Kong? I thought that
yeah, there were other things in there too.
It mentions that there's going to be 20 billion people in the next 10 years. I think that should be next 100 years, and I don't think our population is ever actually going to quite hit 20 billion. I think a lot of the things they wanted to do in here are better done in Trinity Assassin, which is a game that I think is quite fun, and the story path system is pretty close. It was fine. I think there was a lot of missed opportunity, and as someone who has enjoyed the Technocracy, that felt a little sad. One of the things that seemed kind of interesting to me is that Brian Campbell, who I associate with the Technocracy, did not appear to be one of the core writers. I'm not sure what the circumstances were for that, but Brian, your contributions in some way were missed. The art was utterly milquetoast. Even in the sections that were supposed to look dynamic, it is just flat and dull. I would have preferred illustrations or something else. We get a few early on that ain't bad, but it just kind of goes downhill in terms of energy, and every one of those frontispieces is just, except for one, is a person in a suit talking to someone. Those are my thoughts for the book. What did you think, Adam?
Yeah, I got to agree. With 227 pages, there should have been a lot more gameable material in here. Specifics, stat blocks, or things that storytellers could run with, rotes, plot hooks, and things like that. There just should have been a lot more gameable material in here. I've got a Post-it note on the inside cover of my book saying Chapter 5 and 6. Because when I'm going to pick up this book in the future, I'll look at Chapter 5 and 6 and like pick some things out. The rest of the book, it's like, do I need to read this again? Don't think I do. One thing that was kind of interesting about this book is it pushes more of a paranoia of the Technocracy is sinister, except for Chapter 4. Now, that was downplayed greatly in Revised Edition. It was like, especially the 4 Conventions books at the end of Revised Edition said, hey, the Technocracy is a bunch of lovable guys, and we're going to make the world a better place, and all that bad stuff is in the past. And this book, in Mage 20, comes back and says, no, there is a sinister element to the Technocracy, and I think it makes them interesting. There is no info on Horizon constructs in here. Now, it states that the Revised Edition Avatar Storm metaplot is optional. It does hint in Mage 20 that the Mage 20 line is it happened but it's over now, or greatly reduced now. And so it's like, okay, well, if that's the case, how about some Horizon constructs? No, nothing, no mention of them at all. And so it's like they're following the lead of Revised Edition, even though they're saying, hey, we've opened up and there's more possibilities now. There are many sidebars throughout this book that make it clear if you want specific, actionable, storyteller-facing information, look at the first 3 books of Mage 20, because it's in there, which means it's not in here. So that's a weakness of the book. There are strong feelings against this book, stated repeatedly, strong feelings against the U.S. and its citizens. It does rather stand out in this book. So let me just say I'm sorry that the authors have to live in such a terrible country. I kind of like living in the U.S., but I'm not enlightened, so what do I know? I usually don't talk about artwork. It's really not my strong suit, but, I gotta say, it really did stand out in this book. I think one of the reasons is I see a lot of art that looks like it started with a 3D modeling program, and then they sort of like built on top of that to make their artwork, and I think that's why there are a number of illustrations in this book that look dull and lifeless. It's like there's no emotional content there. I looked at the there was a Mage 20 book that talked about the artwork throughout the years for all the editions of Mage, and they kind of poked fun at the first edition artwork and said, isn't this a little silly? But at the same time, when I go back and look at the artwork from first edition, it had emotional impact. I mean, I looked at that and there was like an emotional feeling there. It's like, oh, there's danger, there's action, something is about to happen here, somebody is taking a risk. And it's like that leaps off the page from the early artwork. And looking through the artwork in this book, it's like there's no feeling here. No one's doing anything in particular. Nothing in particular is about to happen. There's no thought of anybody at risk anywhere in here. Also, I think that this idea of a enlightened, hopeful technocracy doing useful things is not the best thing to express in art, because you get a lot of people sitting in offices. I don't know if there was like some like tongue-in-cheek parody undercurrent there. If so, I guess it went over my head. Sorry, folks. But looking at this artwork, it's like, hey, everybody's in a meeting. Yeah, I've worked in software companies. I've been in meetings. They're boring as hell. And here we are, role-playing characters who are sitting in meetings looking at PowerPoint presentations. No, please, let me out of here. Yeah, I want out. I don't want to role-play these scenes that I'm seeing in the artwork. It's just not exciting. Also, this book, I got the impression that the majority of the contributors to this book wanted to focus on more realistic, believable material, and they thought that would make for better games. And unfortunately, for me, the result was less interesting material. When you're more reasonable, realistic, plausible, you lose a lot of that innovative, fun, crazy kind of stuff that we got in earlier books of Mage. It's like, yeah, what if someone just opens up a magic door to a crazy other world? Or what if the technocracy is hiding some secret engine that warps reality and breaks the state of California or something? I mean, that kind of stuff is cool. We can run with that. We get ideas. Even if we tone it down for our own games, at least there's something to start with that we want to start with. In this game, in this book, there's just a lot of material of, hey, that crazy stuff in the past. We're much more with it now. And it's like, yeah, okay, I guess it's nice to be with it in real life, but in a role-playing game, excite me, please. That's what I turned to RPG books for. So that's my general thoughts on the book. Do we have any interesting quotes to take us out, Terry?
Yes, this book had a bunch of interesting bits of bang-up writing. Page 55 has the headline, Biological Explosion Detected. That sounds like it belongs in the section on young child prodigies and how T3s all help in parenting. I don't know what a biological explosion is. I don't know if I want to know, but I'm glad the Technocracy...
I don't want to clean it up.
Exactly. I'm glad the Technocracy has their best people on it. The other one I kind of liked was the old saying, extremity in the service of liberty is no vice. A minor variation of the technocratic code of extremity in the service of reality is no excess. I thought that was an interesting way to put it and be like, nope, we're perfectly willing to kill an entire village of people if we really have to. We'll feel bad about it, but that feeling of badness will simply be that it's going to result in a lot of paperwork. So what are we reading next, Adam?
Next up is Operatives Dossier, which clocks in at 100 pages. It was the bonus content that was created thanks to all the people who contributed to the Kickstarter. Terry and I, of course, both contributed to that Kickstarter, so we helped make that possible. And that is something I'm actually looking forward to because it should be more pointed, specific, gameable material. I have not read it. I can't say what's in it, but I got that impression flipping through it. Flipping through the screens of the PDF. We get a chapter on the digital web. There are some, I think, more pointed story suggestions at the end of that book. So, hey, gameable material, I'm all for it. Let's take it one step further with the Technocracy in Mage 20.
And I looked for your name under the backers, and I did not see it, but I did notice that in the introductory fiction, there's an Agent Simpson, so I'd like to think they gave you a special call-out. Of course, he's the bad guy who's torturing John Courage, but still.
Well, yeah, we're not all perfect, but no, I'm listed as Adam S. in the back. I just tried to keep it light. I'm associated with the podcast. I don't want to look like a glory hound or something.
Oh, so I shouldn't have been Terry R. and then my social security number? No. Oh, crap.
You're cool. You're cool. If you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you have questions, comments, or feedback, we are listening, and we will reply. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show, then you can help us out quite a bit by leaving a review for us, and that would make us more visible in other people's searches. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. And as Terry said at the beginning of the episode, we are working on that website to make it better for you. We list all of our show notes in there with each episode so that you can click on further information that we're able to provide there on the website for you. And, of course, we are deeply indebted to our executive producers. Terry, can you let us know their names?
I would like to thank Oracle Buck Farmer, Oracle Christopher Phillips, Oracle Josh Hillerup, Oracle Jay Widener, Oracle McHale, and Oracle the crew of Erebus. I'd also like to thank Alex, Alexia, Andrews S., Andrew Edelstein, Anon, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Boo, Boogers, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Derek Simsick, Gargle Noir, George Laura, Guy Conan Stewart, Ia Bolt, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aran, Nathan Weaver, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo, Richard Pat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, and Zach Rules. Thank you so much for your support.
And if you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes like this one. You would also become part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
Go change reality after completing the appropriate forms and submitting them into your manager in triplicate to get them approved. Bye. I talk good. Oh man, it's like exciting, but the opposite. This could put a cup of coffee to sleep.
Hey, look, I have been unreasonable in the past, and I reserve the right to be unreasonable again in the future.
Go change your reality after applying. Go change reality after